for the charter schools.
Mr. Wilbanks, thank you very much. All right, gentlemen, let me throw out a question, and I want to start on a very basic level because as I've gone around talking to people I know about this subject, the conversation almost always starts off with, what is a charter school anyway? So let me ask Mr. Peevy and Mr. McCutchen, can you just give us a basic understanding of what exactly is a charter school?
Charter school is a public school that has to abide by all health, safety, and civil rights legislation. They cannot turn down anyone that applies. They must apply for all the accountability. They must give the same test. They must have open books, have an audit each year that is open for public inspection. They must have a local board of community leaders that governs the school. Those meetings are required to comply with all the open records and open meetings laws. And they hire teachers that are state employees able to participate in the state employee retirement plan. And so for all practical purposes, they are public schools. A charter is just a contract that gives flexibility in return for accountability. So I like to say they're doubly accountable. They're accountable to the authorizer, whether it's the local school board and the State Board of Education, or in the case of the commission, to the Charter School Commission. They must meet their financial objectives and academic achievement objectives, or they can be shut down, and they have been shut down. And the flexibility often is around curriculum, it's around the school calendar, it's around technology. There are all kinds of things that they could do that essentially, the key thing to remember, it is simply a contract for a public school to get more flexibility in exchange for accountability.
Gentlemen, we agree with this definition. Anything you want to add to that on the subject of what is a charter school?
I would just add that in 1992, when the charter schools first was authorized, it was authorized to be a school that provided something different, to be creative and innovative. It was not about educating the same kids in the same geographic area using the same curriculum, but it was something different. We're seeing today, particularly with the privatization underpinning of this, that charter schools primarily in this state, there are exceptions of course, but primarily schools that get public money to educate the same kids, same geographic area, using basically the same curriculum. We think that's a duplication of service. That's not what charter schools was really intended to be.
You want to add to that, Mr. Willis?
Yeah, thank you. If I could just add, one of the things I think that creates some confusion on this issue of charter schools, because I think we would all on this panel agree that charter schools can be an effective tool. But one of the things that I think a lot of people get confused about is that there are different types of charters that exist. There are charters that are authorized by local boards of education and then approved by the state. And then there are even what are referred to as charter systems, where an entire school district has elected to become a charter. And then there are those that have become charters directly from the state authorization. And I think the important thing to understand about this amendment is that it really is addressing the ones that are authorized by the state, not by the local boards. And that's where it gets to be confusing, because many folks in local communities may already have a local charter, and they think that that charter is falling under the implications of this amendment. And so it's a confusing thing that can easily be misunderstood. And that's why I say I think that charters are can be a very good and effective tool, because they can allow some flexibility. But for example, you may have a charter exist where transportation would not be provided, and that may be appropriate in that context, but obviously that can be different because, as they mentioned, it's based upon a contract. So I think it's just important to know that there are different types of charters and to understand the differences between those as it relates to this amendment.
And we heard about one example of a charter in the introduction as Mr. Peevy helped to start Tech High in Fulton County. Was it Mr. McCutchen, excuse me. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Just real quickly, I went to Georgia Tech. We had a meeting with the school superintendent in Atlanta, and at the end of the meeting, I just sort of said, we've been working with Georgia Tech and a bunch of charter schools in Rockdale and other areas around the state. They're math and science, STEM-focused schools. Why can't we do that here in Atlanta? I live in the city of Atlanta. She says, well, that sounds good. Why don't you put together a plan? So we said, okay. We put together what that would look like, brought it back to her, and she said, that's great. Why don't you do it? I said, well, we're a think tank. We don't do things. We come up with ideas and let other people do them. But we decided, if we all believe that all kids can learn, and what better way to prove that than go into the inner city with a high school and try to be successful. So we created a nonprofit, mainly a lot of Georgia Tech graduates that were frustrated they couldn't hire, and the Technology Association of Georgia, frustrated they couldn't hire kids coming out of the Atlanta public school system because they weren't prepared. And we started a school. Got Barbara Christmas, who ran Page, a great teacher organization, to be our CEO. And for 7 years, we were up and running and had over a 90% graduation rate. And even despite the fact that a lot of our kids were coming to us reading on the 3rd or 4th grade level as 9th graders. That's what you're facing, and that's what a lot of schools, and I know in Gwinnett County you're facing a lot of those issues now. It's tough. Poverty and kids that you don't have much parental involvement, it's really tough. So that's how it got started, and we unfortunately had to close because the school system made a decision to apply what we think is illegal charge of $1,000 per student. If we'd had this mechanism, we think we could have stayed around, but that's how we got started.
Okay. Mr. Willis, you made some favorable comments about charter schools here a second ago. So you're not opposed to the concept of charter schools altogether?
No, it's quite contrary. I certainly value charter schools. I think they certainly have a purpose.
You agree they have an important part to play in the system?
I do, and certainly want to make that without qualification. But I think it would be a mistake to say this Amendment 1, is about charter schools. Not about charter schools. Mm-hmm. It's about how they get authorized. Mm-hmm. Who pays for it? It's about bypassing your elected local board of education. It's about putting that authority into the hands of 7 people at state level who, again, have no accountability to the taxpayers. But more importantly, I think all of this is at a time when we can ill afford. 2/3 of the school districts in this state operate less than 180 days. Most school districts have furloughed teachers, anywhere from 2 to 6, 8 days. There's been no pay raise in the last 4 years. And I think at a time when the state is challenged for budgets, I think going back to the Amendment 1, not about charter schools, but about authorizing schools and then privatizing those, and quite frankly, if you look at the ballot language, it's extremely confusing. At the desire of a local community, does that mean one person, or does that mean a majority of the community? State control, is that State Board of Education? Is that a appointed board? Who is that? And then the confusing ballot language was further confused with the preamble that really was written just recently that speaks about increased student achievement, implying that charter schools do that. If you really look at the study across the country, the global study of charter schools, the Credo study out of Stanford University, don't take my word for it, check that out. They don't do any better than traditional schools.
I want to talk all about that in due course, but let me get to a little more basic level right now, and we're going to reach pretty much all of those issues you just raised. And I'd like to ask you, particularly Mr. Wilbanks, to describe for us the historic process that has been in place and currently is in place for approving charter schools. And most all the charter schools that exist right now or have existed have been approved on the local level. Is that not right? Can you talk a little bit about the process through which you have to go to get a charter school approved on the local level?
It comes from a petition from someone. It can be someone out of state, someone in state that appeals to the local Board of Education or petitions the local Board of Education with a business plan, and the local Board of Education can evaluate that, and most districts, I think, use the criteria that the State Department uses. I know that's what we use in Gwinnett. We pretty well take that exactly as the state does it. And we evaluate it both from the curriculum standpoint or the educational value as well as the financial piece. Is it a viable plan? The local board can either approve or reject that. If they reject it, it can be appealed to the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education can choose to approve that or not. Or if the local board approves it, it goes to the state, and the state board can either, again, reject it or approve it. So there's an appeal process. That's the process that's been in place, except when the Charter School Commission was created, I believe, in 2008. And that created the commission that they could go straight to the commission to be approved.
Okay.
And that's what the Supreme Court declared was unconstitutional.
Okay. Now, I've read that there currently are something like 200 charter schools now operating in Georgia. Is that right?
314, I believe.
I'm reading some outdated material, apparently. And are all of those, or almost all those, approved on the local level?
All but about 8.
I think that the number, and Mr. Willis did a good job of kind of beginning to explain the differences in some of the charter schools across Georgia. What we're really talking about here is, and I'll cut through that 314 number, that number certainly includes charter districts. As an example, Fulton County was just approved as a charter district, so overnight all of Fulton County schools became charter schools.
Is that what made that 200 number jump up significantly?
That is absolutely one of the things that did that. There's about 15 districts across the state that are charter districts. So all of the schools, by definition, in terms of charter schools, are charter schools there. What we're really talking about here are independent startup charter schools, the ability of a group of parents, community members, teachers, whoever it might be, that come up with a good idea of something new and innovative that they want to do in their community, and then turn around and take that to the local school board and then hopefully work that way through its approval. That number is much smaller. There are only about 76 of those across the state of Georgia. And that's really what we're talking about here in terms of this particular process. We talked about a little bit about the historical piece. One of the reasons and impetuses behind the original institution of House Bill 881, which created the first commission, was in 2007. There were 26 of those local startup petitions. Again, community members, groups of parents, et cetera, that had an idea, took it to their local board. In 2007, 26 out of 26 of those were turned down around the state. That was certainly one of the driving factors behind why the legislature said we want to see independent startup charter schools be a part of the educational options that we have available in Georgia. We don't see it happening here based on that, and so we want to create an alternate pathway, and that's certainly one of the reasons that we did that. I think the commission, when we were in operation, we took a look at about 86 different petitions. We approved 16 of those. All 16 of those had been turned down by local boards in one shape or form or another. Again, it was true the first time around. It's also very true under Amendment 1 that local school boards have the first bite at the apple, so to speak. If a group wants to locate their school in a particular community, then they have to go through the local Board of Education first, and only if the local board turns them down do they get an opportunity to appeal. So that's certainly true. What we've seen since the commission was turned down by the Supreme Court is, again, that same pattern has emerged. It's only about 6 out of 32 or so independent startups that have been brought around the state that have been approved in the year and a half, almost 2 years now, since the commission was no longer approving schools. So we see a similar pattern there, and this is really about providing that appeals process. You know, we talked about the current process that's in place, and I don't want to bore us tonight, although, Judge, you may have actually read through this yourself. But if you read through the Supreme Court decision, it very clearly paints a path that will, with another simple case being filed, another simple court case, erase the appeal process, erase the state board's ability to approve schools. The majority opinion clearly says we didn't rule on this because we weren't allowed to. Justice Namias and his fellow judges in the dissenting opinion give a very clear view that if this issue of the state board's ability is brought to the Supreme Court will have to rule the same way.
You're talking about the state board's ability to hear an appeal from a local decision?
Exactly. Yes. Which is essentially what they turned down in terms of the commission. They said the commission didn't have the ability to hear that appeal, and they very clearly said that the state court or the state board won't have that ability either. The AG, or Attorney General, has issued his own thoughts and opinions on that, and he concurs with the dissenting justices. So I really do think that appeals process is not on solid ground, and part of what this amendment is doing is working to ensure that appeals process remains a viable option in the future.
All right. I wonder if y'all want to respond, Mr. Willis.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that, Judge. One of the things I think that's important to understand about this issue is you know, as it's been mentioned, there's been a process. Okay, maybe that the commission was originally formed because there was concern that local boards were not approving charters. Certainly, obviously, they have in the capacity that there's a lot of charters that already exist, but while the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, I think there's really a second part to that piece. It's not just because obviously even since that ruling, the state has continued to authorize charter schools, state charter schools. We have, I believe, 15 of them right now. Or 15, right, state charter schools that have been authorized by the state. But I think there's another component that's important to this, and that is it's the reality of the financial need or the financial demand that as those state charter schools would get authorized, they would only get state money because they were not authorized by local taxpayers. And one of the issues there is, well, we already know the reality that public education has had $6 billion in austerity cuts since 2003, and for these schools to be able to operate without having local funding, there was obviously even greater gap in funding. And so through this effort, there is the intention and the plans to fund these state schools at a different amount, to, in essence, make up for an equivalent of local taxpayer dollars. And I think that's a concern because obviously you're now going to say I'm going to fund a state charter school at a different amount than I would fund a local charter school. And so if it's about charter schools and charter schools are equal, the state will provide a different amount of funding to one compared to the other.
I want us to get all into the financial issues, and we're going to get there in just a little bit, but I want to stay for a minute on this question about exactly who is doing the authorizing. The complaint that I've read from those opposed to this amendment goes something like this. Why isn't the remedy here if a local board is not being responsive to those who want charter schools? Why isn't the remedy at the ballot box to elect other people on your local school board who will be responsive to you?
Well, first of all, there are parents all over the state of Georgia that would love to live in Gwinnett County because they have a wonderful school system. They started a charter school, Gwinnett School for Math and Science, that I visited about a month ago, and I told Superintendent Wilbanks, one of the most amazing schools I've ever seen. That's not the problem. The problem is there are only 9 counties in Georgia, 9 school systems that have approved startup charter schools. And we saw the record was that in most places, you know, we worked very closely with the Atlanta public school system, but in most cases, sort of like the fox guarding the hen house. And that is the issue where and this is why the ballot box is a problem. It's the tyranny of the majority. It's not sometimes the majority of the people. It's those that are not being served, those that are falling through the cracks, that do not have much pull, do not have the ability to mount a campaign, that need an appeal process. And those are the people that we believe, should have that opportunity, and that's why it's needed. And it doesn't mean we do not call these public schools, government schools. I graduated from Gilmer County High School. I'm proud to do that. But just because, every child is different, and it's hard to be everything, all things for all people. If you go to Georgia Tech and you don't like math, you're not going to be very happy. But that doesn't mean Georgia Tech's a bad school. So there can be wonderful school systems, but still people within that school system, a small minority, that need something different. They need a smaller school. And we must admit there are some dysfunctional school boards around the state, and there are some schools that are underperforming. And we need to do everything to fix those. But what do we tell those parents that are stuck and can't afford to move and can't afford to go somewhere else? I think we need to give them an option.
Gentlemen, y'all want to comment on this?
Certainly, children need options, and parents and children have a right, and I think an inevitable right that would allow them to go to a school where they've been educated. But I think we have to really go back to the real issue again here. This is not about whether charter schools are better or worse. I think the data is out there that there's some very good charter schools. There's some obviously very good traditional schools. There's some very poor charter schools. There's some very poor performing traditional schools. But public schools we call them public schools for reasons other than they just receive public funds. They're for the public good. Like the road out here, the infrastructure that sewer systems or whatever. And I think as a nation, we have to think that one of the things that I think this country has been built on and allowed us to be where we are today is how we go about educating children. We educate all of them. If they show up at the schoolhouse door, we educate them. Dr. Hilda can't send a bunch away or tell them when you get ready for school, come on back and we'll enroll you. We have to take them all. And I think what we need to look at, the Constitution of not the state or the nation, we need to think twice about changing that. Changing it for a reason that some would say is needed. Well, 90% of the school children in America, I believe there are like 54 million school-age children in America, 1.6 of them in Georgia. 1.6 million. They attend public schools, and we need to be about making our public schools the very best they can be. We have some things we need to do better. Don't deny that at all. I think every school district in the state, we talk a lot about low-performing schools. You may not have one in your school district that meets the qualification of No Child Left Behind, but if you've got a list of schools, you got the 5 lowest performing schools in your district that you need to work on. I think we all need to do that. But I don't think charter schools is the answer to that. I think charter schools has a tremendous role to play. Like I said, I've recommended 4 charter schools that's been approved by our Board of Education. And we have some of all types, okay? Mm-hmm. And they do well. But there was a reason for it. And to just open that up, I think you have to look at who's really supporting and funding this the passage of this amendment. Most of them
we're going to get there. Let me ask you this question to follow up on what you just said. You're talking about the importance of public schools, but aren't these, in fact, public schools that can't turn anybody away?
Well, by definition, they are, but, there's more to going to a school than just tuition free. You have to get there. There are other things that go with it. The parents have to be able to do certain things. Certainly, I'm not denying that charter schools aren't public schools, but they aren't public schools like the elementary school near here. I don't know the name of it. But wherever a child comes from can go to that schoolhouse door in the morning, and Dr. Hildreth, they admit them.
Gentlemen, you want to comment on this?
I'd actually say that that's exactly what charter schools have to do. They all have a defined attendance zone, much like the elementary school that we're talking about here. The only difference that they can make is if they have 500 seats in a building, they can only put 500 kids in the school. That's literally the only difference there. So I think they're public in every sense of the word. They offer options for those, if we want to talk about 5%, if we want to talk whatever number we want to use in terms of failing schools in Georgia, they offer options for those parents who have kids in those failing schools. Judge, back to your original question about the ballot box issue and how you change a local school board at the ballot box. I think if you look at the life of a child, because I'm a parent, I have 3 kids in public schools myself, I am concerned immensely about the life of just pick my 4th grader. And if she were in a failing school, and it would take me 3 years perhaps to change 1 board member on my Board of Education, and then perhaps another 3 or 4 years to change 2 to get to a point where I had a board who might be friendly to hear these kinds of options, I've missed that opportunity in the life of my child. And I think that's the challenge that we face. I certainly agree that the democratic process that we have here at the ballot box is a much needed one, and it's something that communities should continue to use. But I don't think we should lock children into failing schools potentially, or even a school that might be performing well but doesn't work for them, just because of that. And so I think that's really what these charter schools represent. I think they're absolutely public in every sense of the word, and they provide those kinds of options for parents who don't have them otherwise. So.
Now, the amendment doesn't take away the power to locally charter schools, but it adds a second path through the state charter commission. Help us understand how that commission works. How do those members how are they put in place? How does that work?
Certainly, I'll take that one. The process is very well described in House Bill 797. As Kelly mentioned, it's exactly the same process that we had in place beginning in 2008. So we've seen how this works. We've seen that it operates smoothly and efficiently. The 7 members that end up making the commission are all nominated by the 3 respective parties. The governor gets to nominate 2 folks for 3 positions, 2 folks each. 2
nominees for each
Yes,
position.
2 nominees for each position. The lieutenant governor does the same for 2 positions, and the Speaker of the House does the same for the remaining 2. Those nominations all go to the State Board of Education, and then the State Board of Education makes the final choices for who serves on that commission.
Okay. And the State Board of Education comes from, just for those who don't know?
Is appointed by the governor.
Okay. How many members on the State Board of Education?
There's, I think,
15, is it 15 now? Yeah. Congressional
One for
districts.
each congressional. Okay. So we just grew a new one. Or 2, actually.
Yes. Could I add something? Because one of the criticisms that we're going to set up this big state bureaucracy, and again, we have an example in place. How many people in your bureaucracy?
We had 4.
4 people, and there's really no need to add any more because the charter school division at the Board of Education at the state level already is reviewing the over 300 schools there. Adding another 15 or 20 is not, there's no need to hire any more people. And the best thing about it is charter schools pay for their own bureaucracy. There's a 3% fee taken off the top that goes for the administration. In fact, the State Charter School Commission was so efficient, it reduced its fee from 3% to 2%. So they were the most efficient of all the school systems that have charter schools, and they hired professional staff because quality is what's so important. I think that gets lost. They were very careful, only approved a very small amount of the petitions that were brought to them. And I'll be the first one to say a lot of petitions should be struck down because it's hard to start a school. You've got to have a lot of expertise. But they were very careful. They took their role seriously, but there's not a large bureaucracy. There's not this dual system set up. It is an appeal process, and it can easily be handled by mostly the people that we already have in place.
Okay. Let me, as I ask another question, let me mention to the folks here, if you've got questions that you've written down on your card, if you want to hold those up, Tamara will come around and collect them at any time, and in just a minute we'll turn over the questioning to you all. Let me ask Mr. Peevy, you were part of that very first state charter commission. You were the executive director, is that right?
That is correct. Mm-hmm.
And I think I heard you say earlier that during the operation, or was it during the very first year, you had 86 applications, and out of that 86, 16 were approved?
That was over the term of the commission being in operation. That's correct.
The commission was in operation from 2008 to 2011?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And at that time, the state Supreme Court struck down that process as being unconstitutional, and that's why we have Amendment 1 today.
That is correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So it sounds like most of the time the commission agreed with the local decision, because each of those 86 had been turned down at the local level.
That is right. That's one of the requirements beforehand, yes.
So they approved 16 out of the 86. I'm interested in thoughts from over here about the operation of that commission that we've seen so far.
Just one comment that I want to add. I mean, and you know, obviously, the process, you know, of going then to the state or to the Charter Commission, there could also have been, and I don't know, and Mr. Peevy could answer this better than I, but of the 16 that would have been approved, there may have been requests for modifications or changes and you know, adjustments to what was originally presented to the local board before it was its final approval. So there may have been, you know, it's part of the process, but I think that does, you know, attest to the fact that, you know, it is something that local boards have to look at very carefully to make sure that it meets the needs of the community, that it satisfies the legal requirements, and that it is going to be provided in an equitable fashion to the community it serves. So it's not a simple and easy process. And I think the part that I just want to reemphasize on this that I think is confusing here is that we need to be careful, and we may get to the wording of the amendment later, but we need to be careful when we make a judgment or make blanket statements that by authorizing or increasing the number of charter schools, we will blanket increase student achievement. We are all about doing that. I think to transform public education, which those of us that work in it day in and day out believe that we need to do better than we're doing, it's going to happen even beyond just the ballot box. It's going to happen community by community. Ms. Pippin was sharing with me beforehand an excellent example in Henry County here of the collaborative effort that's going on beyond just the school system and was started through the chamber. There are a multitude of ways that we need to get communities engaged in making a difference, catching kids earlier, getting them ready for school, things like that. And it really needs to be careful about making it sound like by increasing the number of charter schools, we will increase student achievement for all. I just think that's a dangerous assumption to make as we go through this process.
Is there research, and then I want to hear from this side about the subject of what we know about the quality of education from charter schools, and then I want to talk about how this affects state and local government financially, this proposal, and then we're going to start looking at questions from the audience here. Mr. Wilbanks, I think you, in your opening, were talking about research that about comparing the overall quality of charter school education versus public school education. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, there was a study, it's called a Credo study. It was done at Stanford University. Very large longitudinal study. And it, you know, is on the website. I wish I had the number, but if you CREDO, I believe it's very easily available, or just give me a call or somebody, Mark, you may know, or somebody. You can go look at it, and it pretty well says that of all the charter schools in the country, 17% maybe do a little better, 27% do worse than traditional schools, all the rest of them about the same. And then if you drill down and look at those 17% that really do better, they're very small, have a very high per pupil expenditure, all those things. My point in all of this is that there's a place for charter schools, but we shouldn't change the system in this state. We should not change the Constitution that would allow bypassing your duly elected local boards of education where the citizens go to the polls and vote for them. You can always call your local board member. If you have 7 people at the state, actually they could all come from the city of Atlanta, or they could actually all come from Henry County. There is no difference of where they might be. I believe local governments, state governments, and national governments work when they're partnerships. When the local communities have input, have accountability, and then hold people accountable. And I think I challenge anybody to show me a great community and a poor school. They don't exist.
Gentlemen, you want to talk about what we know from experience or from research about quality of the charter school education versus the public school?
Sure. First, let me say, whenever we're talking to charter schools that they're interested in entering a position, we always tell them to go work with the local school board first. Never, go at it alone. I agree. That's a much better situation if you can work with the local school board and the community. Absolutely. We don't disagree on that. It's true the record is mixed looking at the national studies. What we do know that the gold standard studies, the double-blind studies that have been done that look at the kids that applied to a charter school but didn't get in, so their parents were similarly motivated, what they found was in urban areas the achievement of African American kids was significantly better in charter schools. And in fact, it significantly put a dent in the achievement gap. So that is very positive news. The other thing that we know from national data is wherever there has been school choice, kids have options, it has improved the public schools. So the competition has made everyone better. We've particularly seen that in Florida. What's at issue here in Georgia is let's look at the schools that were approved by the commission. Again, we're lucky because we have this, and I think the record's pretty clear of those schools that are in operation today, they are outperforming the traditional schools in their system. So in Georgia, the record's a little bit better than nationally. Nationally, it's mixed, but with certain subpopulations greatly benefiting.
Peevy, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I certainly think that that's true. And one of the challenges that I think we see here is we talk about, and I think it's a great comment, but in terms of show me a good community, I'll show you a good school. We certainly know we have bad schools in the state of Georgia. There's a proven track record out there that we have some challenges that we need to solve. Charter schools are not a panacea for that, and I don't want to leave here tonight with anyone thinking that they're a silver bullet. But I think bringing this issue back to children and parents, because that's really what it's about. It's about that child who is in a school that is not performing well. Perhaps it's in a bad community because it's a bad school. We connected those two, but you're in a bad community or a bad school, and you don't have an option for doing anything else. We certainly have choices in Georgia if you have enough money. You can always put your kids in private school if you have enough of an income that one of the spouses can be at home to homeschool. Those choices exist. But what we're talking about here are choices for those parents who are locked into a school based on their zip code that doesn't perform. Or perhaps it's performing, but it doesn't meet the needs of their individual child. How can we provide more options for that opportunity there? And I think that's what this is really about. Kelly is right. If you look at the numbers, Governor's Office of Student Achievement has looked very extensively at the state-authorized schools that were approved by the commission that are operating now. Almost every one of them in almost all categories is performing at higher levels than the schools that surround them. So certainly that's the data we're seeing here in Georgia. I think one of the other interesting pieces that GOSA has looked at is that of the 15, 16 state-authorized schools that we have right now, 75% of them represent the only choices available in public education in their given community. So I think that's also a very important thing to think about when you look at whether or not we should have a statewide authorizer in the mix. What you realize is that statewide authorizer is playing an extremely important role in providing options to Georgia students and their families. So.
Let's talk about money, and I want to ask you sort of a two-part question, and I'm going to start here and then let this side respond. Two questions about money. One, does this proposal take money away from local schools? And two, do your esteemed opponents have a point when they question how it makes sense to set up a state bureaucracy, if you will, when state education budgets have been cut by several $billion dollars, if what I've read is correct?
What's the first part of the question?
Does this proposal take money away from the states, from local schools?
In Georgia, the Constitution clearly says that local property tax funding is under the purview of local school boards. This amendment does not change that. It clearly, and it says in House Bill 797, clarifies that the local property tax funding will not follow the child. So that's absolutely correct. Now, they say it's unfair to fund these things at different levels. Well, when we were debating on how to fund these schools, the local school board said, well, if the state's going to approve them over our objection, they better pay for them all. Don't expect us to pay for them. So yes, the state has to pay for them, and we have a law that requires adequate funding of education. So the way that is established in the law is the part that we make up to supplement the fact that the local school board is not putting money in for these schools is based upon the 5% of the lowest funded school systems in the state. And so if you add that with the state funding, what you find, if the state's charters were a school system, they would be the third lowest funded school system in the state. So here's the issue. Is it taking money away? You know, it is not taking the local money away. In fact, if they have one less child to educate and they still have all their local money, mathematically, the amount of funding per student increases. Small amount given. The issue is that we can have debate upon is the cost. Is it more expensive? Are there economies of scale? And there's been some research done looking into this, and you can argue it both ways, but that's the issue. It's not the revenue side, it's really the cost.
And there's variable cost.
That's right, exactly. Economies of scale.
The schools are going to save some variable costs for each student that's not going there, but they're still going to have some amount of fixed costs.
In the big picture, I simply say this, that the governor's office and the Department of Education and Barge have agreed on the funding number. And that average for state chartered schools is 62% of the state average for traditional schools. So my issue is, you know, are we going to save money when we're funding these schools at 62%? I think mathematically, yes, you're going to end up saving money in the long run. And so the budget issues, I think in the long run, I don't understand where that come from.
Gentlemen, are we costing our local school systems money by doing this?
Yeah, let me correct something from my good friend there, Kelly, on that point. If you, and y'all weigh my words here quickly now, I don't want to be wrong on this one, but I think there are 15 special state charter schools, right? 2 of those are online virtual schools. One is Odyssey. Totally, there are about 15,000 students in the 15 charter schools. Odyssey has almost 10,000 of those. It's funded at one level. The brick and mortar schools, which have 5,000 of those students, is funded at another level. So if you compare the funding level, it's like 82%. Now, if you throw in the charter schools,
right,
you got to. So you can argue all these points, obviously, that you really want.
It's still less.
It's still less, yeah.
Well, but the communities choose to do that,
Right,
obviously. And I think to say it's not going to cost the local districts any money, you know, might be true if, I believe you have a Georgia code there with you, Code 20 statute.
Thought it might come in handy.
It says, it has something in there called the QBE, Quality Basic Education Act, that was passed in 1985 under Governor Joe Frank Harris. And that determines how money flows from the state to local school districts based on students. It's a student-weighted formula, okay? Now, the amount of money that code book says that the 180 school districts in this state of Georgia are supposed to get, we're getting $1.1 billion less. Now, eventually that equates down to the local school district, and I don't know about Henry's, but for Gwinnett, this year it's $113.3 million, less than what the QBE formula says we get. Last year it was $113.3 million. Now, over the period since 2003, the FY3 budget, for us that's $631 million.